politics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by the professor of law at Chase Law School, Ken Katkin. Welcome to the show, Ken.
Hey, Trey, it's great to be back.
Well, last week we had a unique show. I got to join in with Jay and with Mike because of the unfortunate passing of Mike's mother. And again, we want to be thinking about and remembering Mike and his family, you know, here from the show, and we'll continue to do that. But I will say it's nice to be back with you, Ken. The difference between you and Jay are always unique. I'm the go-between in some way. So I like to do that space, but I'm you know, we've done this a long time now, and I'm sometimes a little more comfortable when we're doing it, you know?
Yeah.
So I don't know. Maybe someday we'll have to have the, Jay and Ken reunite for a boxing match version of The Politics Guys. And
It could happen.
It could. I mean, it could. Who knows? Anything is possible. Well, this week, though, listeners, what we're going to be taking on is we're actually going to start by taking a look at, well, the failed attempt to change the filibuster and talk a little bit more about the voting rights bill. That was the intention for modifying the filibuster rules in the Senate. We'll also, after that, we're going to move forward and take a look at the United States Supreme Court brief unsigned opinion on the January 6th committee's ability to get some documents and talk about some of the concurring opinions going on there and a dissent. We'll move from there to talking about some of the most recent developments with the New York's Attorney General as it finds some significant evidence about the Trump organization. From there, we're going to move forward and talk about gerrymandering as it might impact the 2022 and then 2024 elections, and a little bit of history there on gerrymandering. We'll also have a chance to get in and talking about the Wednesday's polls on Biden and what this looks like in terms historically for him, in terms of approval rating, and what Ken and I think his attempts this week at maybe his change in tone for COVID policies, the masks, etc., and then a few smaller stories if there's time. That's what we'll be doing on the show. So we're going to take a brief timeout, and we'll be back in just a moment. Okay, so Ken, one of the big stories this week was Democrats had hoped to change the rules of the Senate in order to make a voting rights bill possible. This comes after last week, and we had talked about this, myself and Mike and Jay, about some of the difficulty. Biden had a rough week with his language from his Georgia speech, leading to a number of Democrats defecting, leading to the hope that maybe a filibuster would still be on the table. However, it would not turn out that way. As a matter of fact, the filibuster change is going to die. Now, I think, Ken, that you're going to be arguing in favor of some filibuster changes. And I thought, we talk about this, but I don't know how often we've actually had a chance to kind of lay out for people what in the world is the filibuster and how it moves forward. Well, the filibuster, listeners, it's actually a practice of the ability of talking a bill originally to death, or the idea that every senator in the Senate has the ability to talk for an unlimited amount of time. And this was a way, therefore, in the modern times to change votes. Well, how does that all work out? And I thought I'd kind of run through this, and then Ken, we could kind of talk about it in terms of what was hoped to be changed this week. So all the way back in 1789, we actually get our first ever instance of kind of a proto-filibuster taking place. It's our early work of the Senate. Pennsylvania Senator Maclay writes in his diary, quote, "The design of the Virginians was to talk away the time so that we could not get the bill passed." And this is kind of what most scholars will indicate as being the informal filibuster. But now, the actual ability of a filibuster doesn't emerge in the Senate until much later. It's not until 1805, when Vice President Aaron Burr was then presiding over the Senate. Vice presidents preside over the Senate. Ironically, historically enough, freshly indicted for his murder of Alexander Hamilton in the duel. And he actually offered some advice to change the way that the Senate worked. He argued that the Senate was a great deliberative body, but that a true great deliberative body needed to have a cleaner bill of slate when it came to rules. He argued that the Senate kind of had a mess of rules. And so the Senate would change its rules and get rid of the opportunity to have majorities be able to end debate. So as you move forward from 1805 and 1806, they dropped this idea of bringing the previous question motions forward, which allows for the modern incarnation of the filibuster. Now, we still have one other piece of it, and that's what comes back to what we're talking about here in the show. And that is, well, can you ever get anybody to shut up then? Well, that's cloture. And that last piece of it would emerge in 1917 when the idea that you should be able to end debate in the Senate, but to make it a supermajority. And this actually is tied to World War I. There had been a number of unsuccessful efforts to create a cloture rule in the early 1900s. But in 1917, you get kind of a pivotal issue. At the outset of World War I, Republicans were able to successfully filibuster President Wilson's desired proposal to arm merchant ships. And as a result, this is actually what would lead Wilson to talking about them as being a little group of willful men. But he demands the Senate change the rules, and the Senate would so do, and they would pass that cloture rule, arguing that it was a necessary war message, and as a way to have a little bit more efficiency. And so that's where you get Rule 22 out of the Wilson and the Democrats on national security. And so this would lead to the ability of having filibusters coming from Aaron Burr in a formal sense, and then this Rule 22, the ability to, with a supermajority, end the filibuster. And I'm going to have to point out, I am indebted to the work of Dr. Sarah Binder for what I know about filibuster work. So Ken, the Senate Democrats this week were hoping to change Rule 22, and i.e. not to have it to us apply to as many things, potentially voting right acts. So what did you think about this move? I don't think it was ever likely to happen. Did you think it was the right idea? Is it time to revise the filibuster? Was this the moment? Did Biden and Senate Democrats blow it?
Well, I don't want to say they blew it because they never had enough votes to do it.
There was never any hope.
Yeah. So, but I think the policy of changing it, particularly with respect to voting rights legislation, is the correct policy. And I also actually think, although most people disagree, that Schumer did the right thing by forcing a vote, even though the odds were he was going to lose it. I think that was right also.
And why? I am interested in that bit of the maybe the pragmatic of that. What's the advantage there?
Well, because I think there was maybe about a 10% chance he could win it, and it was worth it for that reason. And if I could explain that, the problem he was up against is that he had two members, two Democrats, Manchin and Sinema, who kept telling him, "Don't bring this up for a vote because we're not going to vote for it." Right. Mm-hmm. Now, what that basically means is they weren't going to change their mind about that. Right. So if he didn't bring it up for a vote, then the chance that he would get the rule change is zero, right? But I think what he thought is that if he did bring it up for a vote, that the political calculation for, at least for Sinema and maybe for Manchin, had a possibility of changing, not a probability of changing, but a possibility of changing, that it would be an uncomfortable vote for them to take, and they didn't want to take it, but that if they had to take it, and they really had to go on record, either on Martin Luther King Day, refusing to move forward a voting rights bill, which is what they did do, that maybe the pressure there would be enough to make them change their mind and actually move forward the voting rights bill. Now, it didn't play out that way, and I think the probability was always that it was going to end the way it did. But I think he was figuring, well, there's maybe a 10% chance that the pressure will be enough, I'll succeed, versus, no chance at all of succeeding if I don't try, because they were certainly, Manchin and Sinema were never going to change their position that they'd rather not take this vote at all. So I think he was right to push it, and I think he actually is no worse off than if he'd never pushed it. It looks like a defeat for Schumer or for Biden, but I think that's not actually worse than just looking completely impotent, which is how they would have looked if they never brought it. They were really between a rock and a hard place there.
Now, last week, one of the arguments that Mike made was effectively that Democrats have overestimated the amount to which there's popular support behind some wide sweeping voting rights changes, and brought up a number of statistics. As a matter of fact, even though we're talking about this over the Martin Luther King Jr. Holiday. Among African Americans, there actually isn't as much support as one might think for these kinds of measures. So do you think part of the problem was the item itself, although there is a vocal minority of people who want to have some rather sweeping potential voting changes, for better or for worse, it doesn't have the same kind of popular position that earlier voting rights acts might have had, combined with the fact, if you take a look this past week, even among people who don't pay close attention, there's not a ton of support for changing the filibuster either. So I'm kind of wondering, could it even have been a 10%? Do you think that Democrats here are kind of barking up some of the wrong trees in the sense of they have some particular vocal individuals on these 2 points, but they don't seem to account for a majority of either voters or voters even inside of their own base?
No, I actually don't agree with any of that, and I was actually surprised to hear Mike saying some of those things last week. So I think he's, maybe losing the forest for the trees here. He's talking about maybe some very minor measures like voter ID, and saying, I think he said it turns out maybe African Americans don't oppose voter ID as much as
they're pretty supportive of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know the numbers on that, but I'll trust that. But I think nonetheless, African Americans definitely understand that Republicans have been trying to restrict African American voting in all kinds of ways. And so even if you say, one or two of those measures that Republicans are using here and there, African Americans don't have specific objections to, it certainly adds up to a big pattern where I think that, there's a reason that people like Stacey Abrams have quite a lot of support in the African American community for the work that she does trying to help African Americans vote. It's because African Americans do understand that Republicans are trying to use a wide variety of measures, ranging from voter restrictions like voter ID or quick purges of voter polls, or sending out postcards to people that they have to respond if they want to stay registered, or reducing the availability of early voting and mail-in voting and gerrymandering. There's all these measures all at once that are, I think very much, in fact, targeted by Republicans to reduce the ability of African Americans to vote, and are understood that way. So I looked at the polls that you sent me, Trey. I'm not as familiar with polls as Mike might be, but the poll that you sent me showed that 67% of Americans think that it is important that Congress pass a voting rights legislation now. So I don't see how that's consistent with the claim that there's not support for this kind of legislation.
I think when it comes down to is the specific items and what it, I think you might be getting at the point there of, well, what are those things? As a matter of fact, one of the other items, I think I'd sent this, and if I didn't, I apologize, we can still talk about it, was, for example, this looks unlikely to go forward. Why not take other, if the goal is, in fact, to secure voting in a meaningful way, why not other items that might have more popular support? I'm thinking, for example, of making Election Day a national holiday, and follow the line of some states that have made Election Day a holiday. But for example, when you take a look at this, one of the points has been that some of these measures, like making national holidays for Election Day, have not been true for most Democratic states, but are true for things like Florida, which is obviously a Republican stronghold at the moment. So why not take some of those instead of just, in other words, I guess what I'm asking is, it feels like a lot of this is a lot more about a posture vote than actually making any meaningful change that might get passed. Why let it die for everything that if you could make a meaningful change again, like the Election Day as a national holiday? What would you say as a pushback on that?
Yeah, I reject both premises there. One premise is that if there was something that was more broadly popular, so you're using the example of the Election Day holiday, that would give it a better chance of passing in the Senate. I think that's false. I think
you don't think Manchin would be. In other words, you think he's going to be intractable no matter what.
I think that the Republicans will filibuster and Manchin is intractable on the filibuster rule. Remember, there were two votes last week. They didn't only vote on the filibuster rule; they also voted on the bill. And the very bill that you're saying didn't have broad enough support, Manchin and Sinema both voted for it. They just didn't vote to break the filibuster. So their objection was not to anything that was in the bill. And in their own jurisdictions, Arizona and West Virginia, they're not afraid to go back to their constituents and say, I voted for the bill. It's not that the contents of the bill that was the problem. The problem was that they didn't want to break the filibuster rule, and that would apply to any kind of reform that would help people vote. The Republicans will filibuster it.
Now, to add a little bit there, it has having a little bit the Congress. Individual congresspersons will vote radically different on the basis of whether or not they actually think a bill will pass or not pass. So while I think it's valid to say this is how they voted on a bill that they didn't think passed, for example, this can be an attempt to try to stay in with their base, even had they had not had voted for it, if it could have voted. I think you got to be careful sometimes on votes that are, I don't want to say meaningless, but are solely for signaling purposes in the Mayhewian sense, rather than actual possibilities of policy passing. And we do see differences in how congresspersons behave. So I wouldn't necessarily be as convinced as you are there that the two of them would have been on board with it had it not been for the filibuster, just on the basis of that vote.
That doesn't make sense, Trey, what you're saying, because if your original argument was that it matters what's in the bill, and that there was something wrong with what was in this bill, and that's why they wouldn't pass it. But if there was a bill they'd be happier to be associated with, then they would pass it. But my point is they passed this bill. The only thing that they were out there.
They voted for the bill. They didn't pass it.
They voted to pass it, right? But that they weren't afraid of the politics of what was in the voting rights bill. So they weren't afraid of the politics of defending what was in the bill. They were afraid of the politics of voting to break the filibuster. So that wouldn't be changed by changing what's in the bill.
So, for example, then what explains Sinema's response to Biden's speech last week? I mean, in that context, she's talking specifically about his language and some of the contents. Don't you see I see there being a disconnect in her between her comments there and the way she votes. And the way I reconcile that is with the fact that she realizes that it won't pass. So she basically gets two free wins. She can look more liberal on a vote that won't pass, while simultaneously not having to actually engage with what the actual policy would be in any meaningful way.
Sinema never engages with any policy in any meaningful way, but I think that she, when you say she realizes it's not going to pass, no, she's the cause of it not passing. She decides whether or not it passes.
Well,
it's
yes,
not a question
I'm sorry.
of realizing.
I didn't mean to suggest that she wasn't part of that. I'm sorry. Continue. Yes.
And what she's decided is that for political reasons, she wants to posture as though bipartisanship itself is more important than the substance of the bill, and so her position is, I'm not going to pass the bill because it's not bipartisan. She hasn't identified one single thing in the bill that she thinks shouldn't be passed, and she did vote for it. Now, also on the politics of it, she severely miscalculated the politics of it. Her political career is over now. It's over. So Sinema is a lame duck for the next 3 years, and she's out of the Senate after that. She has no road back from this.
So you think she can't win as a result of this particular vote?
Can't win as a Republican, can't win as a Democrat, can't win as an independent. She's completely done.
Okay, I will be honest. No matter wherever we agree or disagree, I love when we have these kind of specific specific predictions that we can go on. I like that. Okay, so Sinema is done and out because of this. I like that. I'll be fascinated to see how that moves forward. Now, so let me then Let me wind back a little bit and ask on the broader front. You arguing that the filibuster practice needed to be changed in terms of voting rights. Why? I kind of lost my train there. I guess what I'm trying to ask, though, is do you think that would fix the Senate's rules, or do you think that's just a Band-Aid over the problem of the filibuster?
I think the filibuster has become a problem, and on balance, because it's been weaponized to such an extreme degree, it might be necessary to get rid of it entirely. And in fact, I think because of the mechanism they were going to have to use to get rid of it, which was you'd have to break the Senate rules in order to get rid of it on a simple majority vote. That might, if it's done that way, then I think that means it's completely gone. I think if we were in a more ideal world and there was a possibility of crafting, what would be a good kind of filibuster rule, I think having some kind of filibuster rule is better than getting rid of it entirely. But I think the kind of filibuster rule that I would want to see would involve a talking filibuster and would involve that the number of votes it would take to get cloture would diminish over time. So that, if people wanted to filibuster something in order to debate and draw attention to it, I don't have any problem with 60 votes being needed for cloture at first. But I think after a couple weeks, it should go down to 55. And after a month or so, it should go down to 50. And that they should have to talk the whole time about why they're filibustering. So I think something like that could achieve all of the goals I think the filibuster rule was supposed to have, of ensuring that things couldn't be rammed through without being discussed, and that the negative aspects of proposed bills could be subject to some sunlight, and there could be proper debate and deliberation. I think those are sort of the good things about the filibuster, and I think there's ways to preserve that. But I think in the reality that we're in, once the Senate is forced to have to break its own rules to make new exceptions to the filibusters, which is the situation we would have been in, then I think at that point it's unsustainable to have any filibuster at all. And I think we are better off in a world with no filibuster at all than a world with an entirely weaponized filibuster that makes the Senate completely dysfunctional.
I'm just going to sum up what you said, which was effectively that filibuster has been weaponized, and as a result of Republicans weaponizing it, there needs to be changes. But you would prefer it not to be completely gone, but rather that it over time would decrease.
Yeah, that's precisely right in terms of my position. But the only thing I would add to that is I don't actually think that's possible, because the Senate rules would require a vote that could be filibustered to change the filibuster rules, which really means the only way they can be changed would be by violating the Senate rules, and
right.
that would work. But if that's done, I don't believe it's possible under those circumstances to reconstruct a different kind of filibuster rule. I think nobody would respect any filibuster rules going forward, so we would just be left without a filibuster.
Well, let me ask about that specifically, Ken, because one of the questions you're using that term, and I recognize why you're using it, that the weaponization of it. So anytime, though, in an institutional setting, you're going to have some kinds of rules to make a decision on how you make decisions. And in the Senate, we have this process of doing it in which we've moved towards not having a majority, but a supermajority, both for reasoned and potentially just institutionalized push. But here's, I guess, my question. I think oftentimes when I hear individuals say that something has been weaponized, what I hear is the policies that I prefer are not being successful as a result of a pre-existing institutionalized tool. But is that really weaponization, or is that simply a side using a pre-existing institutionalized rule to advance their policy ends? So in short, I guess what I'm asking here is it, this is something that we've had in this particular form since 1917, and regardless of the precise way that it's been used in the past, the fact that it exists in the way that one can use it, is it really a weaponization, or are you just hoping to be able to get more particular kinds of policies that you support through? I mean, so for example, would you want Republicans to be able to more easily get their policies through in the reversed scenario?
No, it's really a weaponization, and it's really a 21st century phenomenon. What's changed is the routinization of the filibuster. So, for instance, between 1917 and 1994, there were only 30 filibusters. Right? That's 80 years, 30 filibusters. Right? So, beginning in 1994, which is sort of the beginning of the modern era, and primarily when you have Republican Congresses and Democratic presidents, which was the situation in '94, it became the weaponization involves saying, well, instead of just using the filibuster on issues that we care the most strongly about and not invoking it for every piece of legislation routinely, it's been changed to invoking it for every piece of legislation routinely. It was also changed for a while to invoking it for every single nomination, including nominees who would get 100 votes when they finally got a vote. They were filibustered, and then those rules were changed. And the filibuster was also changed to allow the budget reconciliation process so that the government doesn't run out of money every single year and shut down. Which would happen under a contemporary weaponization of the filibuster. But back in the 20th century, nobody needed to have a filibuster exception for budget reconciliation because nobody routinely tried to block a budget bill and shut down the government every year. So it was, I think to look at a rule that's been around since 1917 and that was only invoked 30 times in the first 80 years it was around, and then see that now that's invoked for every single bill, I think it's accurate to call it weaponization.
Well, I think it's fair when you take a look at the data to make that kind of argument. I oftentimes do wonder about those kinds of rules. But what you were saying at the end was effectively you don't think there's really a way to change the filibuster because you have to overcome the filibuster to change the filibuster. And right now, for example, I mean, Democrats have 50 votes.
Yeah. So, for example, when in President Obama's first term, McConnell was filibustering every single Obama nominee, and that actually caused the Senate to break the filibuster rule, to change the filibuster rule, and say, okay, from now on, nominees other than Supreme Court nominees are not filibusterable anymore. But because they broke the rule to change the rule, even though they excluded Supreme Court nominees, as soon as the shoe was on the other foot, then when McConnell had the majority and he wanted to appoint Trump's Supreme Court nominees, he said, well, Harry Reid already broke the rules to change the rules, so I'll break the rules to change the rules. So, and I think there's logic to that. So I think once that process starts, you really, I don't think it's possible to preserve a well-crafted filibuster rule without bipartisan buy-in. So I think if that leaves us with a choice between the status quo, which is a fully weaponized filibuster rule that renders the Congress dysfunctional, or no filibuster rule at all, I think no filibuster rule is better. But I wish there would be bipartisan buy-in to craft a better filibuster rule.
Now, do you think it's going to be possible even then to get rid of the filibuster? I was taking a look at polling data. So even assuming that we do this, right now only just a little over a majority of Democrats think that the filibuster should be ended, and definitely not majorities of either everyone or nones or Republicans do. Do you think in that environment it's just going to be pragmatically possible to be able to end it, even if that would be in your view, the more preferable scenario?
Well, it's not easy to end it, and we just had a test of it, and it didn't end. But I think that it may be hard. The Dems certainly won't be able to do it unless they have at least 53 or 54 Dems in the Senate, and even then, maybe not. But I wouldn't put too much stock in those polls you're talking about where people say, oh, we wish the parties would get along better and we'd like to maybe keep the filibuster, or we don't know enough about the filibuster to know what we think about it, which is about what a third of the people say.
It's always a hard one. You're right, because filibusters are confusing. When the poll I was citing, just for me to know, it was the January 14th CBS poll that had run in conjunction with YouGov. But yeah, I mean, you're right.
About a third of the people are undecided because they don't understand the issue. But
and
what
that's
I think is much
oftentimes the
more
case on policy issue. It's incredible.
but it's
what do you think about this? I don't know. I mean, that's a common response.
But meanwhile, one thing that I think is a more significant kind of polling than that about the filibuster is that Biden's approval ratings are going way down because he's stymied, right? Like he's not getting things done, and people don't like it when the government promises to do things and then doesn't get it done. And so, if you think that that's the reality of the filibuster rule, right? So the people might say, oh, I wish we had a more bipartisan Congress that could work together better and get along. And, maybe we need a filibuster rule for that. But what I really, really hate is when the government is dysfunctional and gridlocked. And why can't those bastards get anything done? I think people would be more satisfied with a government that could get a few things done.
Well, and now, of course, now we're getting into the nature of people, right? We have a system. Now, obviously, I'm going to be careful here. Our system was not designed with a filibuster, right? That's not part of the constitutional framework. However, put that aside, recognize. But our system is, in fact, designed to be a difficult one in which to get things done. And you rightfully point out to the fact that there is a disconnect between people, especially contemporary voters, between their desire both to have a slow, deliberative process, i.e. what it takes to have, some kinds of across the aisle work, and the desire for immediate efficiency, right? And that is something that has plagued contemporary Congresses for some time. Well, so Ken, why don't we move to one more story before we talk anymore? Because the other big item for me this week was the Supreme Court handing down a win for the January 6th committee. So I want to get to that. Before we get to that, let's just take a brief break. Okay, so welcome back. And so Ken, we're going to talk, and we were shifting gears to chat about the Supreme Court's decision this past week to, on the narrowest of grounds, allow, in the short opinion, that former President Trump had no standing under the law, under any test and so forth. Some of his documents were going to be turned over. We got to talk about this earlier when it was filed. Now, what's unique about the decision, though, was that the court argued, look, Trump had no standing under any of the tests he advocated for. Therefore, they're going to have to turn it over. However, what the court called unprecedented was this question of the ability of a former president, as we had talked about on the show, to overrule a current president. And on that topic, they specifically allowed it to go unsettled. They went out of their way to let it go unsettled. As I read the order, in the words of the court, all of the things from the lower courts concerning President Trump's status as former president must be regarded as non-binding dicta. Now, unless you happen to be a constitutional law scholar like Ken, or you happen to be in the profession of political science like me, you might be wondering, what in the world is non-binding dicta? Well, non-binding dicta are the extraneous statements in a court opinion that are not considered to have any precedential holding. In other words, they don't matter in terms of you can't point to them as bits of evidence as you move forward in similar cases, which is a big deal, because a lot of what the appellate court's decision is that the former president did not have the ability to shield these documents. So, Ken, I was interested. I know there was other things we can talk about in terms of the dissent, but I wanted to start here with what did you think about the court ruling on such narrow grounds and effectively undoing via this non-binding dicta comment so much of what the appellate court had done?
Well, it's a challenge for me because I'm sort of so vested in my view that we have a corrupt and partisan Supreme Court that sometimes it's hard for me to process counterexamples,
Well, but I thought you were going to go that way, and so what I was curious about, we only have one dissenter. It wasn't like none of the liberals were willing to dissent.
Well, because this opinion, I think, pokes Trump in the eye even harder than the D.C. Circuit did, right? So in the D.C. Circuit, you had 2 out of 3 of those judges were Democrats, and they decided against Trump, of course. But I think the Supreme Court's short minute order here decides against Trump on even stronger grounds. They call his case even more frivolous than what the D.C. Circuit was calling it, because the D.C. Circuit thought that it was important to the disposition that Trump is not the president, right? Mm-hmm. And so the D.C. Circuit,
we talked about that a bunch in what would that look like? Yeah.
And so they said, well, maybe he might have a possible argument if he was a president and he could claim executive privilege, but since the president has not claimed executive privilege, he loses. That's basically what the D.C. Circuit said. Now, what the Supreme Court said, which I think is even more of a poke in the eye to Trump, is they said, we don't even have to get into that because your claims on the facts are just so frivolous that even if you were the sitting president, we'd be ruling 8-1 against you.
If you were the incumbent, in the words of the court.
If you were the president right now today, bringing a claim of executive privilege as president, then only Justice Thomas would think there's even any possible merit to the claim on these facts, and 8 of us would say, that claim would be frivolous, even if it was raised by a sitting president. And one of the implications of this is, just imagine hypothetically that Trump somehow gets elected again in 2024, and then he decides to, the court let Biden release all my documents. I'm going to release all Biden's documents. Yeah. well, actually, what the Supreme Court did today is said, no, we might still rule against you on that. Whereas
you're reading it that way.
Yeah,
okay.
They might still rule against a future President Trump. They're just saying that they didn't reach that issue of, whereas the D.C. Circuit was willing to say the current president gets priority over the prior president. And that would have been a rule of law, right? That would have applied, so if Trump became president again, then he would get priority over the prior president, Biden. But no, I think the U.S. Supreme Court, one of the things they did, poking Trump in the eye so hard, is they said, we're going to let Biden turn over your documents, but if you become president again and you want to publicize Biden's documents, we're still going to be very open to letting him come in and argue for executive privilege, because we're not going to say that the former president doesn't have executive privilege. We're just going to say that presidents who commit crimes and try to cover it up don't have executive privilege. Yeah.
Whether they're a president or a former president.
Whether they're president or former president, right.
So I guess here's my next, I wondered about some of that. So here's my next thing. And you even started by saying, you have this, the court has to be so jaded as a result of it. But wouldn't this be another example of a potentially unified court across some of those lines? In the fact
that's what I was acknowledging. Okay. I was saying it was kind of hard for me. I was saying this really goes against my ideological.
I didn't take it that way when you were first saying it. I'm sorry, Ken. No, I wasn't trying to poke at you twice. I try to fight against getting locked in ideologically. No, I'm on your side on this one. I think this court, this was a good ruling, and it was. I think Justice Thomas, I don't like his ruling, but yeah, it was an 8-1 ruling, and even the Kavanaugh opinion, which is the longest opinion of the bunch, where Kavanaugh says that he would have actually ruled that a former president can claim executive privilege. He still agreed with the other 7, though, that that even if we think Trump has just as much right as Biden to claim executive privilege doesn't apply to cover-ups of crimes, and so it doesn't apply here. That was a really important statement, because to say even under the case, Kavanaugh, he's appointed by Trump, but you still wouldn't get it.
Yeah, but he was saying he would give Trump a presumptive executive privilege over other kinds of materials, whereas the 7 in the majority said we're not even going to decide that. We're going to leave open the question of whether a former president can ever claim executive privilege. But whereas Kavanaugh wanted to actually rule, I think he wanted to throw Trump a bone, and he wanted to say, I'm telling you, Trump, you can generally claim executive privilege in my view, but just not over these materials. But over most of your presidential materials, you could claim executive privilege even after you're not president anymore.
Yeah, for this kind of, it's not isolated in that sense. Continue.
Yeah. So last time we talked about this, about the leading precedent on this subject is the case of United States versus Nixon, the Watergate tapes case. And in the Watergate tapes case, the 9-0 unanimous Supreme Court both recognizes that presidents enjoy a presumption of executive privilege, and that most of their communications with their staff is privileged, but yet they find that there's a limited exception to that when the asserting the privilege would thwart the administration of justice. So that's the central holding of the Nixon case, and it seems to me that eight out of 9 justices thought that applied exactly here, and of those 8, 7 said, so we don't even need to worry about the question of whether his status as a former president matters. But one, Kavanaugh, said, well, I would still clarify that he wanted to give Trump as much executive privilege as an incumbent would have, but just to say, that doesn't, as in the Nixon case, that doesn't include the right to commit obstruction of justice by the invocation of executive privilege.
Do you think any of this is going to continue to kind of surround Trump? I know that Mike and I talked, I don't want to spend a ton of time here, but just maybe as a quick response, Mike is almost already predicting a Trump presidency. Do you see any of this as being a possibility of hurting that, or do you think this does not have a lot of effect on those kinds of the political side?
I don't know. I think I know Mike's mom died this week. I think he was having an unusually pessimistic week. Yeah, and he usually is somewhat optimistic. No, I don't see any Trump presidency. I think the odds that Trump will be in prison by the time of that election are small, but I think they're about equal to the odds that he'll become president again. I would describe.
Sure, that is one of the most effective put downs that I think that I have heard in recent times.
Yeah, I'm going to say 10 to 20% chance in both cases. 10 to 20% chance he'll be president. 10 to 20% chance he'll be in prison before election day and sitting in prison through the election. More likely, better than 50% chance it'll be neither. I think, but I think, I think he's got big troubles. Not only because of the January 6th committee, but also because I do believe Merrick Garland's investigations, as we've talked about, are slowly working up bottom to top. And, I think he's a year out from ever having any real risk of being indicted for anything, because a lot of people there's levels of people between the people who ran into the Capitol on January 6th and President Trump who are going to be indicted first. But I think these indictments are making their way up the hill, and that will continue. And that won't end even if the Dems lose the House, because Garland will be the Attorney General for 4 years. Mm-hmm. So those problems are out there. He's having increasing problems with the civil and criminal fraud cases in New York. And meanwhile, in Georgia, there was just a special grand jury that's about to be impaneled as well. So his criminal and civil liabilities are going to his troubles are going to get worse and worse over the course of the year, and that is going to impact his ability to become the nominee, I think.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that you bring up the New York, because that's one of the things we want to talk about. But actually, we're going to save that discussion for the New York because this is going to end our ad-supported preview. So if you've been listening, I thank you so much. This is going to be the end of our ad-supported preview. If you'd like to listen to me and Ken as we move into talking about the New York Attorney General, gerrymandering, and a number of other stories, the way to do that is to become a supporter of the Politics Guys. And you can do that by heading to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us through PayPal by going to politicsguys.com/support, or through Venmo, where we're at Politics Guys. So again, if you'd like to continue through here and also get the ad-supported version, in other words, the ads go away, you get additional bits of the story, you can head to patreon.com/politicsguys or politicsguys.com/support, or through Venmo on @politicsguys. Finally, if you are not in a position right now financially to support the show, but you would like access to that show, we can set you up with that if you just shoot an email to mike@politicsguys.com. So again, if you just don't have the ability to be a financial supporter, but you are curious about what we're going to be doing next, you can again send that email to mike@politicsguys.com, and you'll happily get hooked up with a full show. Thank you so much.